That's right. This is title.
Otherwise, you would know. You know. We don't know that. We don't know that.
Well, so something else. Is the apple steel from my wedding, which I used to get across borders in certain countries.
It is actually 9:30. All right, we'll give people a minute or so more to get settled for first meeting of the day.
Wasn't he?
Oh, you did. What? You skipped them.
Oh, is that like a? No, it should be okay. Rep to the future may delay actual publication. I don't know if it matters.
That you are not sitting far enough away from him. Data tracker is not Dropbox. Not Dropbox.
How come you just didn't upload version?
Why didn't you just do a revision?
Yeah. You uploaded a newly titled.
Yeah, I upload the same time, it would show up twice at the same time.
No, it would show up as version 2 of the slides. So now we're playing version 0 of the final deck rather than version 1 of the original deck.
If I keep the title the same, it just doesn't. No.
There's a button that says upload revision. If you, yeah. Anyway, I think
We found it humorous, especially since there was a presentation at the chairs lunch about use version.
He just did in data tracker exactly your canonical thing.
If you have the same title, it'll version it.
Yeah. Yes. We're now playing version 0.
I was telling you, right there, I do not have anything about upload.
No, because you've already pressed the wrong button. And we are training him right now. It's all right.
I've seen before where we lined up with the slides.
Yeah.
It says the same name multiple times. That's what I'm trying to do.
We should also avoid that. Yeah.
That's all I'm trying to do.
All right, if everybody has a chance to get settled, we're going to get started since it's already 3 minutes after.
Folks, please. We're 3 minutes after.
Are you up first? Am I up first?
Standard slides, I think. Whatever. Okay, thanks very much for coming to order. Welcome to the first meeting of Thursday. Quick reminder that this session is being recorded like all the others you've been in this week. Similar to all the others, it's held under the Notewell, so please, honestly, especially if you're a first timer, if you don't understand the implications or the full power of the Notewell, then do raise a hand and investigate, because it's important, but it basically says that what you do here is the business of the working group, and yeah, please don't do things that would compromise that in a technical way, and also the note really well to not do anything that would compromise us in any emotional or conduct kind of way. Basically, be cool to everybody. All ideas are equally worth hearing. And yeah, if you do ever experience any negative interactions or harassment or anything, there are places to go where you can raise that. And I think the IETF is pretty good at addressing things like that if on the rare occasion they happen. Blue sheets, it is important to record attendance for all kinds of reasons. Mostly I just like feeling popular, but it's great if you can, because it helps with like scheduling rooms and things for next time. So you can either scan the QR code on the big board outside, or much preferable, if you go to the on-site tool now on your device, then that will also give you access to things like polls, which we may well be doing later. You can participate in that and also see the chat, especially here. Oh yeah, okay. Especially here with lots of remote people like AJ, it's good to be able to participate on the chat. AJ, you've left the queue. Did you want to say something?
You kind of sussed out. I was going to ask you
yeah,
about the
it's okay.
volume. You got it.
I didn't realize it was a poor pickup. Thanks. Thanks, Ori and AJ. Okay, so note takers, the cute hedgehog. Thank you, Steve. Any more? Anyone on the chat want to take notes along with Steve? That's true. So Steve's presenting. So one more note taker, at least partial. Thank you. Thomas McCarthy Howe is in. Thanks very much. So I think that's it. So any agenda bash? I noticed there's a bit of agenda bash because there isn't actually whatever 45 minutes of me. Steve's in the middle of that, but we'll work it out. The slides are in the right order. Okay, so if no agenda bashing, then Henk. Very well rehearsed session from Henk.
Good enough. Hi, I'm Henk. Oh wow, I can do the clicker if it works. Hi, I'm Henk. I'm doing the when I say usual recap of what we're actually doing here. That's feasible because it's so simple. So we are trying to help in the domain of supply chain. Sometimes you need some auditability and accountability for that. We call that integrity, transparency, and trust. Therefore, the working group name. And our starting scope is software. We are not limited to that. We will recharter in the foreseeable future to accommodate for hardware supply chains. But as the IETF is very familiar with software design, I think, and coding and running code, that's our first scope. We have a set of documents. Basically, at the core of it is the architecture. We will come to that very soon. We will run through that. And we outsource. So a lot of these building blocks we are relying on with the architecture are best actually specified in COSI. There's a certain thing that we need. It's called an append-only log. Initially, we thought that would be Merkle trees only, but we assumed that might be too prescriptive. So the file name is not actually really good anymore. It's called COSI receipts. Quick update here, a quick reminder. We were told by Russ Housley that every counter signature with a single piece of metadata edit is not a counter signature anymore. So we're calling them receipts. There are profiles for receipts. A lot of them too are already in development. And we have a specialization of not including payload in a COSI envelope. That's the COSI hash envelope. The details will be later. And we have a reference API fitting to the name SCITT. It's called Scrappy. That is the supply chain reference API. So this is our core set of documents that we're typically working with. And I clicking again. Here we go. So supply chain entities talk about stuff. They typically have artifacts, and then they're issuing statements about those artifacts. And these are wrapped in an signature envelope, and as I already spoiled that with the last slide, we are stuck with COSI here. There's no alternative for the universal, I want to say, signature checking and verification of the issue and the provenance of the statements. We always use COSI sign 1. That is our thin substrate of interoperability that we're actually introducing. That's done by a service. That service maintains an append-only lock. We have in COSI the new registry, they call it the verified data structures. These are currently only Merkle trees, but again, that could be something else either. The service enables you to get a receipt if you register a envelope. That is also called sometimes a notarization. Never forget, when you go with your contract to the notary everybody's there, the notary signs something, but the contract comes back with you. Nothing stays at the notary but the fact that you did something. So whatever statement you just notarized, you have to take care of that. SCITT is not doing that. You can attach the notary to some silo, and that silo will keep those statements, but these are auxiliary services. Relying parties later on can come back to the transparency service with a receipt, for example, and then make an audit. It depends on the authorization. Like I want to say, a whole audit requires the most authorization possible, and maybe you can audit just your own trade. This is a quick overview of what we did with COSI here. Protected header hopefully is a term that you understand. We are using the CWG claims RFC for header elements because we want to have an issuer and a subject here. We are not reinventing that. We highlight a little bit what content type or / media type it is that the statement is encoded in, and we give a thumbprint of the issuer. So that's very, very thin frosting. We add a little bit a little bit more. Here you can see where the payload goes, where the signature goes. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. And when you stick the receipt that you get from the transparency service into your unprotected headers placed in the statement, signed statement, then you made it a transparent statement. The proof that you made it transparent can be transported in the statement itself. It can be scraped out. Then it's a signed statement again. You can have them separate and combine them at will. And you can have multiple receipts if you notarized or registered them at several transparency services, which can be kind of useful. There's also a convenient feature. We have a certificate chain here to validate everything. So if you are unable to locate that, it's possible to put that into the protected header also. That's basically all we did on the COSI level. That's our base data structure that is intended to facilitate all the usages that we define in the architecture. Here are some of them, right? Basically, I don't have to go through this. This is self-explanatory. The business is basically any business. And we facilitate, for example, CI integration. So every CI could issue their signed statements about their build evidence. Evidence is a terrible term, but about the build assertions, and then notarize them and make clear that this actually happened. This basic feature has something to do with the expiration of certificates. So certificates tend to expire. And in order to prove after the fact, years later, decades later, that at some point that certificate was valid and the code signing was okay and worked at, I don't know, 1980, that is enshrined in the VDS, which is the append-only log maintained by the transparency service. So this is also accountability after the fact when CAs are gone, companies are gone, that certain things have happened. So if you are thorough with your notarization, then you can actually have an actual really good audit trail here for your supply chain, which I basically just said. So this is the typical recap. Are there any questions about this? Was this confusing to any newcomers, or is this okay? If that is the case, I hand over to Steve. Clicker mostly works.
Okay, so thank you. And so for the architecture, we're at draft 11. We've making quite a bit of churn on this to make sure we're incorporating all the different feedback. And I'll just do a quick recap of that. So one of which was we stabilized the picture again. In the last session, we were joking around how it didn't quite fit on the slide right, and Hank had to rotate it just to fit. So Michael had given us some good feedback, so we jiggered that again. Same content, just laid out in a little bit more dense format. The main thing here we wanted to actually highlight, because this came up, I'm sorry? Sure. Thank you. See, I'm trying to not.
I think,
cough.
Michael, if you want to contribute, you should go to the mic.
The main highlight that we are keeping here is the fact that multiple transparency services, or a statement rather, can be placed on multiple transparency services. because you might be interacting with the company that distributed the software and another company that's making statements about that software. And you could actually make statements around the same piece of art or same artifact on two separate services, get separate receipts, and then you can take that SCITT statement and put the multiple receipts into its collection. And now you can hand that around, and now you can show how multiple parties on multiple ledgers are making statements around a particular artifact. So that's been pretty helpful to be able to articulate that. Just from the architecture perspective, the first two actually were a little bit of a box of snakes that I'll have a section of slides on, where we wanted to just simply replace append-only log with VDS, and that cracked open some good conversations. So we'll cover the first two in that section. And the rest was continuing to scrub and kind of polish the last of the architecture. The last one around the use cases, there's been a pretty healthy debate around, are use cases really good to create drafts around or good to facilitate the conversation around the draft? So we have brought in some of the use cases into the beginning just to put structure to the document, and that's what we did there. And the other one around the X509 profile, we focus on how X509 can be used as one of the stable identity types that we can reference, but it's not the only one. You can use others with SCITT. So we were just making clarity there that it's, because it gets a little confusing. There's some places where if you're using X509, this is required. But if you're not using X509, it is not required. So that's where we were just trying to clarify where some things are optional, even though we're saying they're required. They're only required if you use that type. So that's what's happening there. We've also been really trying to focus on Scrappy. And here we've actually gotten a lot of work done. If we had a whole section on Scrappy in 121, talking about a large list of issues and a lot of discussions on those. And we've cranked through all of those, and you can kind of see there's some pretty meaty items in there. And just about a week or two ago, we've got it in really good shape. So we'll talk about the reference implementations that are happening with it. So we feel good there. And just Hank mentioned some of the other drafts. So the Merkle tree proofs, that has been submitted to ISG for publication. So we're seeing good progress there. There's still a couple of feedback items that are being addressed. And then we have the first two profiles queued up and ready to go in as well. Cozy hash envelope we reviewed yesterday, and the pre-allocation was done. So that was good. Again, thanks, Hank. And there's one clarity, because as it was being implemented, there was a point there that it was a little unclear whether the content type, pre-image content type, could be in the unprotected header or protected header. So we'll fix that up and make it consistent with the rest. And with that minor change, we got feedback. It's ready for last call. So you're kind of seeing these things really coming together. With that, okay, I'll give it to John. Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Erin Welling from Oxford Information.
Can you, can we get her in the queue?
I thought I raised my hand.
Oh, you are in there.
Yeah, she's in there.
I've picked up on a few things. I am new here, though. Thank you.
Welcome.
Mainly because I talk a lot. That was one of the first things I had to learn was the queue. So anyways, so my question is that when I see these type of last calls and so forth, has it been tried anywhere? Okay. So in order to get to the last call point, this has actually been implemented with the transparency service.
Yeah, both our company at Data Trails and Microsoft has got implementations. What's Trade Verified has done some work as well to implement and test the APIs and test the infrastructure. Yeah.
Great. So it comes back with some kind of lessons learned and the adjustments are made. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a great point, and that's why you're seeing. So the question was just, are we getting feedback from actual implementations? And absolutely, and that's been some of the debates that we've had are related to, do we really need that? And then we can talk about, well, here's what happened when we didn't have it and why we want it. So we've churned quite a bit. I don't say quite a bit. fundamentally, I think we're in the same place we started, but there's a lot of good polish that's happening along the way.
Thank you. I don't want to take up too much time, but are these case studies documented somewhere for us to?
No, I don't think we've done a case study.
Or I might be using the wrong terminology, but
Yeah.
whatever.
In the docs, we do
Yes.
have references. I forget what what's the BCP 205. We've got references for reference implementations to verify the work, and it's in Scrappy. I thought we had it in the architecture as well.
Great. Okay, so I could look those up. And
Yeah,
check it out.
absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
You can look them up in the meeting materials here because I'm going to present that in about 20 minutes.
All right. If there's nothing else, I'll give it to John.
Okay, thank you. So I don't know. Oh, AJ's in the queue. AJ?
If we talk about the diagram, no, I'm not going to go deep into it. Actually, Steve provided an interesting point of context that I had not thought about, and I'm willing to contribute or let others do it if it's valuable. You pointed out the interaction between two different organizations. I don't think we've ever done that in the draft, in the text narrative around it, or somewhere in the diagram, and I hadn't even really thought about how obvious that is, but it's not explicit. Food for thought.
So two different organizations can be
one making software and one doing analysis of software. Not to get too deep into the weeds about what is an artifact or not.
Exactly.
Like, yes, that could be obvious. I'm just saying, like, it's interesting that we don't really make that explicit so much in the text from having read it yesterday.
Sorry, the speaker.
No, I'm done.
Hard to hear you talk.
Is this better? I can eat my own mic.
I have to check because I know it's been in the document at some point. So I kind of lose reference to what's currently in it, but there's two scenarios that can represent that use case. So one, if you have a company that is hosting their transparency service and they allow multiple vendors, multiple entities to register signed statements on their transparency service, then you have multiple issuers that basically that entity is represented as the issuer. So you can have an endorser, if you will, sign statements that says, Big Co has been endorsed by Secure Co. So now on that same transparency service, using the same subject, you'd be able to get statements from different issuers for that subject. So that's how you can have that on the same transparency service. What's in some cases I view as more interesting is you've got Big Co on saying, this is my software and it's wonderful. Everything's wonderful. Look at all my friends that say it's wonderful. And then you got another entity over to the side that's saying, yeah, we found some problems with that thing. And Big Co may not want to take statements from that company. And if you trust Secure Company 2, we'll just say, and you're subscribing to their transparency service because they provide statements around lots of software, which is what security scanners do today, then they can also make statements around the same artifact using the same subject. And now you as a consumer of that, not the home consumer, but the entity consuming statements around multiples, now I can aggregate the subjects from two different transparency services and see Big Co and their friends say this is wonderful, and Secure Company says, yeah, you've got some problems, and then Big Company might issue new statements that says we've solved those problems. So that's a really good checks and balances that you can do. Today, we do this already with security scanners, but there's no any standard between those. So here, those, and we're not saying they have to do this, but it's an opportunity. You can use SCITT as a transparency service for multiple entities to be making like or disliking statements, conflicting statements around the same artifact. So Ori might like something and John doesn't, or probably the other way around. And I can choose which I trust. So anyway, that was kind of the main goal of it.
I agree that that's like very useful and important. I was just saying that as far as I just reskim the narrative text, also there's only one issuer. Like that's what I was saying, but that might not be super important for now. I hadn't thought about it. I can clarify what I mean outside of this aha moment.
I have to check. I'll have to look again to see. I like I said, I
Let-
know
let-
that was in there
let
at
me
one
chime in
point,
here.
so I'll have to double check.
Yeah.
Hank?
So
I don't know,
there-
Hank. Go ahead.
There's hi Jay. I hope you're well. The first use case is security analysis of a software product. That obviously is not necessarily the producer of the software. So there you have two issues. It's not explicit in the text, but it's the actual first use case that's the scope. If we want more, if it doesn't help, leave an issue. Okay, we will fix that.
Good?
Okay.
Okay, great questions.
Okay, so I'll come in again. Hang on. There we go. Oh, there we go. So yeah, I don't know for this bit whether I have my chair hat on or not, but it's inspired by getting pretty close to work to last call. I fear in some areas the same topics keep on coming up again and again, and we're just sort of, rather than making progress, we're starting sort of polishing more than we need to. So a lot of these things seem to stem from a small confusion over exactly what it is we're doing in the crucial business of interoperable transparency. And there are lots of, we keep on using this phrase, adjacent services, right? There's lots of other stuff that goes into making a transparency system, but what we're trying to do is make interoperable transparency statements, and that's a more subtle, more focused thing. So just to give a bit of an idea, when people talk about transparency, there's the sort of David Brin version, which is just utter surveillance. That may or may not be true, but that's not what we're doing. There's a different naive view in the enterprise world, which is that you just have this enormous filing cabinet full of all the data in the world and you can see it. That is also not exactly what we're doing. What we're really trying to do is bring standards to get digital transformation, whatever, data-driven business, software supply chains up to and then beyond the point that paper businesses have been at for a very long time, which is that if you have anything of any importance, then you want to make sure that it can't be backdated, shredded, repudiated. And with the approach we've taken, provenance, accountability, transparency, and making that interoperable so people can actually use it and consume it, that's essentially what we're trying to do. And this is exactly this multi-party thing, right? So bear in mind, the very important thing here, which I think cuts the line between what we are trying to achieve in a very exquisite and correct way and what is left to the business of adjacent services, is that the data is on both sides of this equation. We're not trying to define a standard for accessing a central repository. We're not trying to define a standard for attaching metadata to one copy of a file. What we're actually doing is enabling you to verify an artifact, whether you have the original or a pristine copy or an earlier copy of a thing that's now moved on, or a later copy of a thing that you used to have an earlier copy of. It doesn't matter. The point is that if as soon as files are or data is moved around in the usual way that they are moved around, you lose a lot of crucial context. You lose all the security protections around it. You're under the control of a different IT admin now. You've got different people wanting to delete stuff from their databases or turn off your access or hide things or update them or hurriedly create an audit report for something that should have happened 6 months ago. All of these kinds of use cases are real and valid and interesting. And what we want to do is create standards that allow you to validate and detect those kinds of problems in the real world where you don't have a central repository, a grand library of Alexandria of everything that you can rely on. So it is about verifiable record keeping, ensuring integrity and accountability. We have a lot of questions about accountability here. There was a back at IETF 117, I want to say, there was a lot of debate about the identity system we're using and whether it can be used to de-anonymize people. Hell yeah, it can. The point of this with the software supply chain, this is business use cases, this is sensible use cases. You want to identify the entities that are making claims. We minimize reliance on trusted third parties for a variety of reasons. The trusted third party might be trusted today, but not tomorrow. They might exist today, but not tomorrow, or in whenever 700 years that Henk was talking about. they may get compromised. And you want to get, some of these issues that we have with PKICs, where a compromise now can invalidate your trust and assumptions and everything that happened before. Those are really harmful to supply chain integrity at scale, and we want to get rid of those. And really importantly, it's about being a prolonged set of time over multiple actors. So you've got to have something highly interoperable, highly easy to use, and highly integrated. It's not about unrestricted data sharing. Transparency in SCITT is not about publishing the actual data. We don't care whether it's published or not. You've just got to have it. It may not even be about data sharing at all. It's not just centralized registries. Again, we're perfectly happy to support those, but it's not the only use case. It's not a replacement for privacy at all. The fact that we're signing stuff and we might encrypt stuff and we're hashing stuff, that's for convenience and engineering purposes. This is not a privacy technology in and of itself. And it's not a replacement for other integrity measures. There are limits to what you can do with good PKI, but we use PKI extensively in the SCITT standards, and then add on top of that to make a good, bigger system. So why isn't just sort of having everything public and open useful? Transparency, right, is just seeing everything, isn't it? Right, but it isn't, because anybody can say anything. And the fact that you can see a thing doesn't mean anything to you in many ways. It may or may not be true. We don't know. And so you have to sort of treat these things as witness statements. I put attestation in there deliberately to upset the rats people in the room, but that is sort of what it is in a dictionary sense. And if it's a witness statement, you need to know who the witness is in order to judge whether you trust it or not. And so there we go, down and down and down the line that Steve and Henk have already talked about in terms of gathering evidence and opinions and stuff about what you're doing. So this is why we can't just simply publish everything, and why we have this quite ornate system now with SCITT, with the issuer keys, with the registration, with the notary, is to get you to the point where you can make an informed decision based on who is saying what about a thing. I've talked about this already, Henk's already done that, so I'm going to skip that in the interest of time. So some scenarios which sometimes help to illustrate why we've made certain choices, which are less obvious than they might be. It's about tamper proofing, but then everybody says, well, why don't you just sign it? The answer is, well, because it's more versatile than just a signature. You can do things with SCITT receipts, detached receipts, and so on, which allow you to be more flexible in where the thing is. Or you can even take a copy of an artifact that was transported. Like if you have an artifact and it moves and then you sign it, then you get into all sorts of weird distribution issues. Whereas if you started off by saying, well, I'm going to just register this thing and you can always verify the artifact later, it's just easier, it's more versatile, it's more scalable for more use cases. Pre-commitment is an interesting, useful one. This is why we have the Merkle trees, right? And again, not just a signature, is so that you can commit yourself something without actually even needing to expose it. So you can say, here's my, whatever, here's a photo of my cat. And later when your cat's been stolen and you go to the police station, you say, that's my cat, you can come with the thing and say, no, I definitely, this is time-stamped and I did this months ago and it's definitely my cat, I'm going to take it back with me. However, and the other thing that's interesting, and this is part of the privacy considerations in the spec, but is very important, this interesting power of being able to prove something without disclosing it necessarily is great for sort of positive audit cases. So you say, I'm not going to tell you what my bank balance is, but I'm going to take out this loan anyway. And if anybody ever audits me, you can come back, I'm going to show you the bank balance and I can prove that, yes, it was this one that I committed myself to. And it's interesting from a privacy point of view that once you've done that, if somebody does manage to get hold of your original artifact, they will always be able to verify it. So even if you delete your copy, it still remains verifiable to people in your supply chain who are able to get hold of one. So it's interesting, subtle privacy considerations, but of course the whole point of the supply chain trust is that, well, if I've got a copy of a contract that you gave me and now you've revoked me from your database and I'm suing you for failure, I need to be able to do that. And so it's a good property, but you have to think about the privacy parts of it. And then, non-equivocation, this is the really interesting one. which is, well, what stops me from just tagging photos of 500 cats? And then when one goes missing, I go to the police station and just claim whichever one it was. So general just signing integrity is a little bit like the world's worst magic trick. So I ask you to come up with a number between 1 and 10. And when you tell me, I reach into my pocket and I have a playing card, it's the right card, looks impressive, but I've got 10 pockets. So like once you've told me, I'm just everything, right? So non-equivocation takes this pre-commitment just one step further to say, not only am I committing myself to something, but I'm committing myself to that one and only commitment. And then you can do all sorts of interesting protocols then, where you don't have to sort of trust each other completely, but you're able to verify the trust in reverse once you go. So lots and lots of improvements over just generally sort of signing stuff or having shared databases, whatever. And of course, we're trying to make building blocks out of this. And the keen-eyed among you will see that we've got a couple of the A and the R are not in there because not everybody needs every building block. Not everybody needs every option. But you want to have kind of a combination of most of them to make a system that actually works. And SCITT and Scrappy have, between them, make those building blocks that make this thing actually interoperable for those purposes that I've been through. So yeah, it's worth, I think, particularly these points of pre-commitment and non-equivocation. These are the ones that sometimes have caused a bit of interest in the architecture, and thought it was worth going through those. But any questions on that or the scope? Go. And then Steve will present his box of snakes at whatever point.
Thanks. Again, Aaron Welling, Oxford Information Labs. I saw the word provenance. So is there, as this artifact moves about,
yep.
Does the provenance include the historical ownership?
Sort of. So I've got a bit in the hackathon readout, you'll see a bit more of that. But essentially, yes, we've defined enough entries in the data structures to do a number of things. So you can trace the history of an artifact. Again, you know, how easy it is to search or find, that depends on some adjacent services that present, like web services, whatever. But we have this thing, the CWT claim, has an issuer and subject that basically says, who am I and what am I talking about? And so if the same issuer talks about the same subject multiple times, these should be inferred to be a number of statements about the same thing. So, and you can do this for builds. Right? So software supply chain, Yang models is a thing I'm going to talk about in the hackathon. So if you want to talk about the same software build or the same piece of firmware, and you want to say, well, I've made it, I've tested it, I've approved it, I've released it, you can use the same subject, for example, to do that. Or you can have a subject which talks about a specific actual file. So here's my SBOM, and I can refer to it. And then you can do things like content addressing, so you can name it after its hash and stuff like that.
Okay, so say it's say that it's modified, right? We have upgrades. So what happens to the provenance when things like upgrades are done? Is it reset to as an original artifact, or is it
so SCITT itself is only looking to provide this flexible accountability, authenticity to the artifacts, and is very avowedly not interested in the semantic content of the payload itself, which you can consider, you know, the meaning of the artifact. So SCITT stays very silent on things like versions, but you as the submitter of a signed statement have all the freedom in the world to encode those however you like. So it's a pretty common pattern. For example, if you've got a content management system or you've got some kind of pipeline, those already define unique IDs for the process or for the artifact or for the file or whatever. And you simply add that either in the subject or even in the body as a link from your original artifact or your original process to its integrity information. And then again, if you have a bunch of receipts that all refer to the same thing, they'll have timestamps, they'll have inclusion proofs, they'll have issuers on them, and you can build that picture of the provenance from there.
Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, Steve, you're up. Yeah.
All right. So this was the box of issues. So I wanted to pull up a Indiana Jones reference, but I figured I'd go with something well, wouldn't get in trouble. So what started as a simple request was clarify what's stored on the ledger. And that was the thing. It was like, well, okay, what exactly are we talking about here? And what are the layers and how do we think about the abstractions? Because back to your question earlier, we've actually got two implementations that have done slightly different ways of handling that. So with that, so when the question is what is stored on the ledger or log, we're referring to append-only log now as the current terminology. Is it just the signed statement? Is it a hash of the signed statement? And if it's the entire signed statement, does that include the payload, which can be bits to terabytes? That's where the hash envelope comes in. What if the payload contains PII information, right? What if the payload could be a hash of the pre-image content, which is what we are proposing with the other draft? And what happens with the unprotected header? Because it's unprotected. Are we protecting that somehow? So what are the details there? And what if the service or the client expects to set values of the unprotected header? You know, what happens when you try to go back and check this thing? Because if you, well, we'll go into it. So if I'm only storing a hash of the statement, bullet 2, then does the service actually have the ability to store the entire signed statement? Yes, but that's not defined in SCITT. That's what we define as ancillary services. So the answer is yes to 1 and 2. That's what the different profiles support. And that's what you see here with cozy receipts and whether it's the CCF one or the Merkle Mountain Range one. And I'll go into a couple of diagrams of that. So this is just an attempt to understand the layering of the different drafts and where the extensibility lies. So we have the append-only log, and there's a receipt profile, so you can specify how that's done. So the purple box there, so the big blue box is a full transparency service implementation. Think of it as a mail server. Mail server would implement MAPI and some other protocols, but it probably has some other stuff that it does. Those who remember Lotus Notes, there was a lot of different things that it did, not necessarily to a standard, but that's an example of where you can go extreme. So within that, the SCITT architecture, we define a registration policy so that when a signed statement is submitted, it can be verified. This is the notary that I think Hank brought up. So if somebody submits signed statements, does that entity really exist, right? Because what a notary usually does is prove that you are who you say you are. They don't care about the integrity of the content or the quality of the content. That's up to somebody else to argue. But they at least want to verify that the identities making the statement are who they say they are. So that's a big part of the registration policy. If it passes registration, then it can be written to the append-only log, and you have choices around which profile you would use for how that data is stored. And that's where we have the CCF and the MMR implementation today. Now, what got interesting is that comment around, well, what do we do with the unprotected header? So if the unprotected header is submitted with content in it, do we write that to the log? Well, so we'll dig into that. So this is the separation here that Scrappy is the API to interact with the transparency service. And then there are additional APIs, the ancillary APIs, which I don't know, I'm starting to play with API. There's nothing in the spec about it, it's just slideware. That are additional things that you can do which are outside of the spec. But we want to make the service complete for whatever that service is trying to accomplish. Scrappy is the min bar for interoperability, and then there's additional APIs that you can do. So in the scenario here, we have the cozy sign statement, cozy sign one envelope that's submitted. In the unprotected header, there is a map of information that comes in. Scrappy just says, I want a cozy sign one statement. It doesn't provide any rules for that. So it absolutely can have an unprotected header. When that comes in, a service may choose to save the signed statement as it was submitted. with the unprotected header. When it goes up into SCITT registration, the unprotected header, we got feedback from some groups that are implementing it, I think it was Microsoft, that they want to be able to use the unprotected header as hints to registration. So one of the X5 chain is example of something that's in the unprotected header that if we stripped it out before it ever got in, kind of defeats the purpose of having this nice property bag that we can transport around. Where we clarified, once you understand the layers, is once you're actually putting it on the append-only log, that's where the unprotected header is a must to be removed. Because if it's allowed to go in and it can be changed, then the whole hash and the integrity, if you match the signed statement of another one, they're not going to match because the unprotected header was there. The fact is it's defined as an unprotected header. It should not be part of that integrity protection. So therefore, that was the clarity that we added to the draft. It's scrappy, absolutely, comes through into registration, sure, but on the ledger, no. Now, if we come back out the opposite way, when the receipt is returned, a service might want to store the receipts. That's fine. Then the receipt comes back out, and now you can see that that signed statement, when it was first submitted, has a bucket in its unprotected header to store the receipts. So now I can actually keep this thing, I've submitted it, and now if you think about sometimes you bring a document in and they can staple the receipt to your thing, maybe staple's not a great idea, but you now have a copy of where it was registered. And you could go, as we talked about in the architecture diagram, I could take that signed statement, submit it to another transparency service. It's going to go all the way through. It'll come back, give you a receipt, and now I can have two receipts on that same signed statement. Michael, did you want to do it in the middle here?
I guess I'm feeling on the fence about this unprotected header. I think that there are situations, and I'm thinking that some of the selective disclosure mechanisms that SPICE has producing uses the unprotected headers. Sure. And so I'm thinking that in some cases, I want a notary service on the thing that I got. Whatever it was I got, including the unprotected header, I want to say, this is what I got, and that's why I did the thing that I did, because this is what I got. But I see your point that later on, if someone comes along and says, I have a similar but not identical statement, how do I go and verify that that was? And the answer is, well, you have a different one. So actually, you don't have the same thing. So that's the thing. So one answer is add a layer of indirection, right? If you want to put the thing with the unprotected header, create some key, sign it, put it in a protected space, and submit that to the notary. Is that I mean, I think that's a reasonable thing. I think there's some problem with the signature that I got. That might not be my signature, right? But I want to record the receipt. Like when I get the receipt from the restaurant, that's not my receipt; it's their receipt. But I'm putting it in my expense report, right? So it's really the expense report that I want to notarize, not the receipt. In which case, I think that the whole part would also be in the part of, I would have the rest of my expense report, that it was Hank and Steve and whatever that was at the table, and that's why the price was so high or whatever. So maybe that's what I think, and maybe that I haven't come back recently to this document, but maybe it just belongs in a applicability statement or a use case example in the appendix.
Yes, I think the expense report's a great example. The thing that we struggled over is everything in COSI talks about the to be signed bytes are to explicitly say to exclude the unprotected header. But your expense report's a great example because I'm getting receipts for all these things, and now I want to submit those receipts as some content I want to protect. Put the collection of receipts in the payload. And now, because that's the whole point of SCITT. SCITT says we don't care what the payload is, it's opaque. So now you have a way to integrity protect that piece of information. That's one. And of course, you have the protected headers, which has an any in it. So you can also load stuff into there. I think the expense report scenario is a good example if you probably put it
Yep.
into the payload.
And actually, just to add, if you're doing that, one of the things you could put in that is I also get a statement from the ATM or the exchange service telling me what the exchange rate was
Right.
that day, and that's why
My
you
expense
know
report's so
that's why
high.
my expense reports the you can't apply a consistent exchange rate because it depends on which day or an hour I submitted
Exactly.
it, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. Thank you. I think this will work, but I think we probably have to articulate it for people who weren't listening to this conversation in 10 years.
Yeah, it's this is always that boundary of how much you put in the document, how much you put in use cases, and how much do you write articles around the draft to explain how to use it, because otherwise we just get bloat. And the whole idea is this thing should survive future examples because we don't know what the payload is. So you can write, the draft doesn't change. You can say, hey, this is how you can use to take receipts and put it in to the the payload or fields in the protected header. Did you want to give more? You're still in the queue.
No, AJ's in the queue.
Oh, it's AJ. Sorry, looking at
You've
an
got-
angle.
you've got the queue down there.
Oh, there we go. AJ.
All right, I'm going to eat that mic again. So, could you reiterate? You spoke quickly at one point, which is funny coming from me, about what should or should not be stored in the ledger or the append-only log in regards to the unprotected header, and what could or must be stored outside. Can you repeat that?
Oh, was this the comment around the PII information? Maybe.
I don't remember being about PII. No, it was like on the the penultimate slide, the one with the diagram that said AAPI and those other things I asked about. So at the end, somewhere in this point, you said you might want a copy of the unprotected header and the originally submitted statement before being signed elsewhere out of band, not in the ledger. However, then you would not want the copy with the unprotected header in the append-only log, something like that. I want to make sure that I actually understood that's a must.
I think I got what you said. So the intent, and this is, Hank was touching this a little bit, and John on the adjacent services, so that's why I've tried to visualize those here, is the ledger is only integrity protecting the signed statement. And depending on the receipt format, that, like, so MMR, it's a hash of the signed statement. So you can't actually get the signed statement from the append-only log in the MMR implementation. What we've done at Data Trails is we store that in an evidentiary store, so you can get the full signed statement that was submitted. And if there's PII information or whatever else is in there, it can be redacted because we can delete it from the ancillary service. It's not an integrity protected per se service. It's intentional for that. If you do delete it, we'll record that it was deleted. But the point is that it's never, that detail isn't on the log. If another implementation wants to take the entire signed statement and put it on the log directly, that's their implementation to do that. In the CCF case, what Microsoft has done is they've restricted the payload to only be a hash. So that's how they're mitigating that PII model. So we've gone at length to, if you remember in the document, to talk about what you should or shouldn't include in your content. Well, like, I shouldn't put social security information or tax information or whatever else in the payload. It turns out that that's sometimes the thing you want to integrity protect. I want to say that this was the, my tax statement that I got back and I'm showing it for proof purposes. I won't put the actual document in there. That's where I would use the hash. So
Okay,
there's just different ways to deal with that.
I just want to make sure I understand where we are with this presentation.
AJ, can you get closer to your mic?
I mean, I'm at this point, like, maybe I'm using the wrong one. We'll see. How about that? I have like 3 things on my computer I'm yelling at. So I just want to make sure that we're on the same page here. This draft specification does not make a decision that prohibits with a must or must not that you have to do something and exclude the unprotected header. I thought that this example was basically clarifying something I didn't understand from the current specification at all. But it seems I misunderstood. Maybe it's fine.
the
Your
last,
follow-on answer made it much clearer to me what you were trying to say.
so the iteration, when we went through the append-only log and VDS discussion, the clarity was that when you write to the append-only log, the unprotected header must be nil. So we did specify that. The unprotected header cannot be put as part of the protected content because it's unprotected. So that was what was causing some confusion in the discussion, and what took us, it was like 2 different weeks on discussion, was where is that decision made? If the unprotected header must be nil, where? And we agreed that it's not at Scrappy, because we want that unprotected header to come in so that the registration policy could use it, such as the X5 chain, but we want to make sure that what gets written to the log is consistent so that I can verify it consistently. And if you include an unprotected header, which is specifically excluded in cozy sign 1 2b sign bytes, that was the piece that we want to clarify.
Okay, I think I'm getting it better now. I understand what you're saying, and some of the comments make it clear. I apologize. Thanks.
Okay. And I think just the last piece that I left out I didn't have up was from the API, that you can do additional queries and so forth and things outside the scope of what we're defining in Scrappy. So it gives you, whatever, I'm trying to think of some mail server kind of scenario that you want to be able to do outside of the scope of what the standard protocols are. Oh, okay. Yeah, that's what I'm missing.
If you take the 3 questions, but make it crisp, please.
Okay.
Thank you. Sorry to take up so much time, but just real quick. So I'm thinking about the big picture of a chain, right? So as artifact, is there a way for the chain to bypass this? For example, you're at chain link, 2, and it goes through some diversion and comes back to chain link 3 without 3 ever knowing that there was a diversion that had occurred between 2 and 3. Is there a way to bypass this and get back in the chain without there being a log that something was modified? Or
No, I mean,
okay.
So I don't know if you want to take this one, but
Is it because the pay? Is it because some kind of hash?
The basic answer is SCITT, as defined, as scoped to make interoperable formats for requesting and transporting receipts for individual artifacts, does not enforce such things. However, it does give you all the primitives and the information available to apply your own policy on top of that. So there's absolutely no way to force somebody to make an API call and get a receipt for what they're doing. But if your goods in process refuses to accept any build that is not accompanied by a recent receipt, then you've achieved your goal. So that's how you do that. And I've got, again, in the hackathon readout, I've got this example exactly spelled out, so it'll probably be clearer.
Okay, thank you.
I was going to take another attempt at explaining that, which is the unsigned headers, unprotected headers, there's no way to prove the order or when they were added. If you're looking for a timeline of proof, it's only the protected headers that you can attest to. And since we allow the receipts that we're talking about from SCITT to be put in an unprotected header because they're signed themselves, then if you get multiple receipts, the order in which they sit in the unprotected header would mutate things. I think that's somewhat to Irma's question, which is things can get diverted. You can generate multiple receipts for multiple ledgers. It doesn't matter. It's basically the thing that's attested to by the signature is what's recorded and applied to policy in the SCITT registry.
thanks, Roy. Hank.
Hank's up.
Yeah, this is Hank. Just for completeness, so the current architecture text highlights that it's absolutely okay to send a signed statement with a lot of clutter in the unprotected header, especially if this clutter is required to do some policy enforcement. But then, at the moment, the decision is to mess with the bytes to be registered and clean that out. As MCR highlighted, with an SDCWT, that would create some problems. So, but nothing is stopping you again from building a transparency service that then again signs that with its own certificate, with its own key material, and adds that to the ledger. As it would, for example, allow you to wrap it again in a cozy sign one that has a TST timestamp or epoch marker. So you can do a lot of things and around that with your API, and nobody is stopping you to do that. And registration policies, especially, are super interesting. For example, you could refer to them with your receipt because they can change over time. It might be very interesting that the second after you register something, the policy changed. So that was the last moment you could do that. And at the moment, we are not doing any referencing to registration policies because these are out of scope. And let's call it an example. I think that's acceptable, like Rego could be a thing that would be here. But these are all next steps. This will be work. We have to get this done, and then we can have statement graphs and have a substrate for payloads or whatever, and can talk about all that. But this has to be stable first to make all these other decisions.
Good. Thank you.
Great.
Great.
Okay, so now I definitely have my chair hat off, but I see part of my duty is writing code to test that the thing we've written actually works. So that's what I do quite often. So very quick recap on Scrappy Shape. What does it do? It's a very minimal reference API because it's all well and good having these great cryptographic formats, but you've also got to be able to get into open source code and libraries and stuff. Otherwise, nobody's going to do anything. So very, very simple stuff. It's basically registering signed statements, getting receipts back, and a tiny little bit of information around the sides that lets you make sure you're talking to the right thing in the right way. We've got a bunch of things working. So you start with an artifact, which can be absolutely anything. We don't care. You put it into a payload. It can be a fully attached payload, or it can be a technically in cozy language attached, but actually hash envelope payload. So just shrink it down, pre-digest it, turn that into a signed statement, submit it, get it notarized, and eventually get a transparent statement along with some record of the Merkle tree, ledger, whatever underneath. And this actually exists in real code. The SCITT stuff uses the standard, we use in data trails, I don't know what Microsoft's using, but in data trails, we use GoCozy. In the notary, just works straight out of the box. PyCozy and CBOR2 also just work. So very, very simple thing. And then adding it into things like the last time we added it into the vcons conserver, we've got a GitHub Actions, and there's even a Scrappy implementation up on PyPy. Michael?
Can you go back one slide?
Yep.
Actually, I think one more slide. Yeah, thank you. So I just always interested in communicating, and these are really interesting icons. And I'm just going to ask, because I think, well, first I hope you'll share it with other people so they can do common things, because I'm very also about people visually having common communication tools in the future. So I just want to understand. So the icon in the bottom, which in the next slide is highlighted, that's a hash because there's an octothorpe in it.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
And the one above it, is that a signature?
Yeah.
Okay. And the one to the right, is that a that's a notary, because that's the stamp.
Well, so that's so maybe this is good because there's a subtlety. So this here is a statement.
Oh, okay.
This here is also
that's a hash of a statement.
So these are the words that we use in the document.
I understood. That's
but the payload is a statement.
Yes.
Which you turn into a signed statement by signing it and putting it in a cozy sign 1 wrapper. So this here is a cozy sign 1, an 18, a signed statement. So this thing is the result of signing one of these things.
One or the other. One or the
issuer
other.
key.
Either the statement or
One
the
or
hash
the
of the
other,
statement.
yes,
Yes.
yes,
Okay.
Exactly.
And on the far right, what's the bottom icon?
Hang on. So
That's the notary.
That's the inclusion proof. So if you look at, so
Okay.
we keep the signed statement. You don't have to, but you can. So we've got the signed statement on the other side of the notary boundary, plus the material that makes up the receipt, which is essentially an inclusion proof for some Merkle tree right now. We haven't defined any non-Merkle versions.
And the thing in the middle has an inclusion proof at the bottom, and then it has a bunch of people with a check mark around it. That I've checked the, what does that mean?
So I think that's probably the weakest of my icons here, but that's
Okay.
that's the transparency service altogether.
And these are all in SVG somewhere? Yes?
They are SVGs, yes.
Okay, fantastic. And you'll put them in the GitHub so people reuse them. That's all I want to know. That's all I want to make sure that we can reuse them in other presentations and get larger mind share, because they're excellent.
I just want to say one thing about.
This is a marketing act. I'm doing marketing here, by the way.
Ori Steele. I just want to make a point about the signed statement. This guy becomes goes
One of those.
One of these.
So those are
And then
actually all little bits.
This path from here up to the top becomes the inclusion proof,
Yes.
and that inclusion proof gets attached here for the receipt.
Uh-huh.
So, it's everything you just said. I'm just sort of pointing that the signed statement goes into the log. The bottom layer of the tree is the log or sequence of statements.
So we might need a wiki page that explains how to use the icons properly, but I think that's fine. I'm really thrilled to see those. I don't know who did them or you did them or whatever, but they're fantastic. Good marketing.
Great. Okay, good. So yeah, the thing that's missing from this that actually is, to AJ's earlier point, the reason for the multi-party iconography in the middle there is that not only can this thing be distributed and decentralized so that you've got lots of copies of the log, but you've also got lots of people who can audit it, because these leaves here, this log, certainly in our implementation, I think in Microsoft's possibly, is completely public. And that means if you get hold of or store one of these receipts, you can then take that inclusion path, you can test it against the log that's public, and so you can tell without having to go and ask the person you're in a commercial dispute with to kindly let you into their database and see their build records.
Yeah, and as I'd like to say, there of course can be transparent confidentiality and confidential transparency. So both is possible, and your transparency can be super secret between you two parties. It can be the conveyance path of evidence in rats between one attester and one verifier, and the log, because it's that super important attester. Or it can be, as you said, a global thing. Policy, again, decides about this. And again, it can be confidential transparency or transparent confidentiality, both possible here, and this is the point.
Absolutely. And indeed, not to labor the point that I made earlier, but the confidentiality and transparency of the log information, which is mostly just hashes in general, is completely separate to your policy on the confidentiality or publicness of the artifacts that it's protecting, holding accountable. So you have total freedom in this way, and the specs have, it's basically a Boston matrix that supports all four. There we go. And there's real code, and we've done a bunch of stuff. So we do have implementations. So my company has one, and Microsoft has one. We should, as has been noted, we should probably make these statements for the architecture as well, because the result of having Scrappy is that, well, we consume signed statements in the right format and push out receipts. So this is going well. So if it's all working and we've got code and I've got wheels in PyPy and all sorts of stuff for this, what else are we doing? Very few remaining issues, but we've got to the point where it's all working, so we're really trying out use cases, and that's why I'm rolling straight through to the hackathon report. So we had a smaller team than normal. I think this IETF is smaller than normal, but 2 people doing earnest work in the hackathon, one on the architecture and one on Scrappy. This is Nobuo Aoki, who is, I think, not okay. So great. And so the 2 things that we did last time, we're constantly trying to make this thing more adoptable. So last time the focus was sorting out the big mess of mixing JSON and CBOR in all sorts of unfortunate ways. And the plan was to, and indeed what we did, was to eliminate the JSON and make everything CBOR and cozy, because that's the IETF way. It makes sense. And we contributed some code to the public that makes that easier. But even easier than using only CBOR is to use less CBOR. So there was some innovation to remove bodies from messages altogether in the editors meetings between, and rely on instead HTTP stuff. And the other one was Yang modeling. So there is actually an RFC, which is a Yang model for transport and description of software bill of materials. And Nobuo was looking at whether you can actually use that and then attest those with SCITT in order to actually come up with a complete working system, which is finally coming to your your question. So everything's working well, whatever. So why was it interesting and complex to try and convert the running code from IETF 121 to running code for this HTTP-based thing? Well, there are two important things. One is that because this is eventually consistent, we're going on to potentially distributed or decentralized systems, whatever. You can't expect that you submit a signed statement and immediately get an inclusion proof back, because there may be some consensus step, there may even be a manual authorization step, who knows? So there's a lot of kind of temporal nature to this, which is why we had the asynchronous thing in the first place, and you have to deal with the IDs. And then the other issue is that you have the potential for something to fail late. So I send this thing in, and the transparency service goes, "Yeah, I'm gonna try," and then for some reason later on it fails, and you need to also be able to pick up that failure information and understand what's going on. I won't labor the thing because we don't have a lot of time, but the clever solution is to use resource moved indicators, which lets you say, "Yeah, here's your placeholder." And you can always come back and get that, but I might tell you it's moved somewhere else if I have now finalized this, or I've put it on a new shard, or I'm going to use hash-based naming or whatever. And so anytime you ask for a thing, you have to be prepared for it to have moved under your feet. But the magic of that is that it makes a huge number of other system issues much, much easier to handle. It reduces the code, it reduces the error paths and things. So it's great, but the mechanics of implementing this on a client-side library was kind of interesting, but it does work. And the results of this is that we've got code up. We've got even wheels up. I would say you can use the 9291 as much as you like. PyScrappy is still in a bit of flux, but should be pretty good fairly soon. So that's all worked. Much better compatibility for retrofit because we don't have all these cozy messages and CBOR messages that people have to parse. You can basically do everything in HTTP until the receipt comes out, at which point you just save it as binary. So really simple to use. There is a bit of a weird game of cups happening where you sort of move the cheese and change the IDs, but that's only a hassle for the implementer, for the vendor. It's not really an issue for clients, so that's okay too. And I think, no new work. Hackathon proved what we'd already done was good and works, so let's carry on. Now, the other one, which is interesting, is, as I mentioned, the Yang work, specifically RFC 9472. This is the Yang model for software bill of materials, and looking to see whether the spec and the things work. So two issues were identified in doing this. So the basic feedback was, yeah, it works, it seems good, but I don't know how to do two things. Those two things were they, did he write them down? He didn't, so I'm going to go to the diagrams. I'll come in again, yes. Surprise and. So the basic thing was, for any given artifact, SCITT works, it's great. How do I do a series linear process like this, build, test, release, bug fix? That's very simple. You use the CWT subject, you talk about the same subject all the way along, done. Very, very easy, that's fine. But what about this happens? I build, I test, the test fails, I go again. So I want to invalidate that one and just use the second one so that I can then move on with a coherent process to release, Then there's a bug fix. I have to test it again, release it again. So how do I make this messy process look like the linear one? So we spent quite a bunch of time talking about this, modeling it out, writing a bit of test code. And the feeling is this feels like we can achieve this with no changes to the spec if we are allowed to make statements about statements. So, and we've gone through this loop a number of times, that you get in Scrappy, we have a reliable identity, that thing that moves around, the 303 locator, we have reliable locators. So if we are allowed to make a statement where the subject is a different statement ID, then it becomes very simple. You do your action, and you're always getting these identities back, and they're always unique. And you can go back to the transparency service and say, hey, actually, here's my test artifact, and I get back ID, let's say 4. And you say, oh, and by the way, this replaces artifact ID 2, and you get a receipt for that as well. And then you can bundle both of those into your transparent statement in the unprotected header. And again, this works. There's a little bit of client overhead to work out the semantics of it, but all of the structures, all of the cryptography, all the protection, all the interactions, and all the APIs in Scrappy work. Oh, hang on, I thought I had a, maybe it was in there. Oh yeah, so the only thought, the appeal to the working group, and I see there are 2 in the queue, is there any heartburn at all about making statements about statements? Bear in mind that this was how we intended to do registration policies back at IETF 118, and I don't think anything's changed. And assuming that's okay, are we happy that that doesn't actually have to feed back into words in the architecture? Because it's not explicit, but it is supported by the architecture. The end. Q, Michael.
Going back to your 2 slides or something just before the statements about statements. Well, this was fine. So when I first saw that slide, I thought you were talking about your Scrappy reference design that you worked on at the hackathon. And then I realized, no, you're talking about real software transparency situations.
Yeah.
You could be talking about yourself, but you're...
I could be, but these are the steps in the RFC that talks about Yang.
Right. Yeah, I got that now. Why does it say Yang up there?
Because the whole point of this thing, I don't remember the number, so I'm going to have to go all the way back, was to check specifically for people following RFC 9472, which is the Yang model for software bill of materials.
Okay.
Does this, can they just sort of glue that into SCITT, Scrappy, and have it work?
Okay, got it now. Yeah, thanks.
Who's next? I can't see who's next.
It's me.
AJ, hey.
Who'd you expect? Can you tell us a little more about what invalidating means? Is the statement going to be like, I have some CBOR that says this previous statement status invalid?
Yeah, so that's an important point. So if we look at this, I'm getting rid of it. It's, as far as I understand it, I'm not the expert here, but I spent a lot of time with Nobuo, and as I understand it, the 9472 explicitly says if you do a new version of a step, that supersedes / replaces / is strictly better than the old version. So what you want to, again, as a maybe I should have done this as a diagram or an animation, but what you're trying to do is take that messy multi-step process and have a relatively simple way of turning it into, at the end, this linear process. So although you can see that the test failed earlier, and obviously it will still be on the log, and if you've got a copy of the receipt, you can go and verify that receipt. But you want the sort of easiest view of this thing to just show you the final state that you're actually happy with. And so that's what invalidate means. And it is very important that it is a strict replacement, because obviously there are lots of other use cases or scenarios where you're not replacing it, you're just saying something different. So if you go back to the XKCD cartoon and one review, say you have a 2 review policy on GitHub, and one reviewer says, LGTM, and the other one says this is a bag of nonsense. One does not replace the other in that case. So we're not trying to solve that issue or whatever, but we're looking specifically in the context of 9472 to support the idea that something that was once said and was once valid is now superseded by something which is more recently said and more valid.
Interesting. And so the conceptual foundation of the thing you described is actually in the like supply chain Yang model RFC that you referenced. Interesting. Okay. Very little to do with this, but this is let the record show, I think this is kick-ass, and I thought this actually opens up very cool ideas for what I think SCITT is cool for. Thank you.
Hi, this is Henk. So as soon as Steve's box of snakes has no visible snakes anymore, we can make up a new box and and talk about the non-opaque statements or the statement graphs and all that, and the things we were afraid about before, and try to make sense of it. And I think that's an excellent next step. There's no milestone for that yet, but I think, at some point, I'm very happy that we can talk about it.
Yeah, I think this is a great stepping stone. It proves we can do it with the current architecture and the current scope and the current milestones. But indeed, once there are things like RFCs that we can point at and have concrete semantics that you can point at, yeah, sure, it's a good next step thing. Okay, good. So that was it. It looks like we're all happy with that. So thanks to the newcomers for doing that work, because it's very validating, proves it works, and amazingly keeps us in scope, which is novel for us. So next, shall I do this? Do you want to do this? We just got the milestone updates. Okay.
Yeah, okay. Steve, so I can't remember who brought it up, man. It was Michael. Was asking about our milestones, and below the fold, hadn't looked at them in a while, so we wanted to go back and revisit them. So it turns out a bunch of them worked out really well. So what I just highlighted here is I slashed out what was the original date and updated to the new date, and put the link to the document. So the top one, obviously we started quite a while ago, and so that's been updated, and that is the draft architecture. So that one's there, and we're keep on churning to try to keep the snakes in the box and get that out to last call. The use cases, I think early on, I'm not sure if it was use cases were still being accepted or not, but we've decided not to publish those, but we did pull a couple of use cases into the document. So that's also in the architecture. The use cases are still up there as an expired document, but we highlighted some in what will become an RFC. The HTTP REST API that we had in the original milestone, we didn't know we were going to do a scrappy thing, but that became scrappy. So that's also in good shape. And that, to Hank's point, I think we did close down that latest bag of snakes, and I think we have one snake maybe in the new box, so we can probably deal with that pretty easily. So we feel good about the scrappy stabilization. And then the next one, submit a counter. So the next one was what became the receipt formats. So that's where we've now got what are you pointing at?
We're pointing at I will echo what's in the chat, which is,
okay.
Was the architecture draft completed in December of 24?
No, where do you see just?
We can't claim the milestone.
Oh.
Succeeded because we haven't.
Oh, so, okay, sorry. So what was done in December of 24 was we closed out the use cases and put it into the architecture. So I see your point.
Okay, understood now.
Yeah, instead of the use cases being a submitted doc, we've decided to abandon that as an individual document and merged it in. So that's a good point of clarity. Preempt, yeah. Well, that particular line is done because it now points to the first one. So the first architecture one now needs to be finished. The countersigning format was what became the Merkle-Tree proofs, which has profiles, so you can do different formats, which is what we've chosen to do. And then the last one, we had to stare at that one quite a bit and go back and reread what we wrote. So it turns out that the interaction model is scrappy, and what we thought about was the information model. We don't believe we need to publish at this point. It just wound up being simpler than we originally anticipated. And I'll let Hank finish that thought.
Yeah. So we are aiming for this thin substrate that is our interoperability layer that is cozy. And that is a data model. And we don't want any other. That's the point. So we would need an information model if you want to be, I don't know, XML. Cool. No, we're not doing XML DSIG ever. I have Russ Housley's recording that he said that was the worst mistake we ever made. And I think there is a good reason not to diverge from that path. So I think we can scrap that milestone. That is the information model.
Yeah. So that one, we were doing this at breakfast. So instead of a question mark, what we're saying is done because one merged up to the other is scrappy and the other we're not going to do. AJ.
Okay, so what happens to the use cases that are not the merge subset? Are we keeping it current, or are we presuming every time we want to add use cases, we're going to have to update the RFC once it actually gets published? What's the plan there?
So no, we tried to thread this needle. Instead of publishing a use case document, which is no longer considered best practice, and instead of just leaving it stale and not referencing any, we felt we wanted to put a couple of the use cases. The representative of what the architecture does not, of course, limit to other use cases. It's just here's some to put grounded context to how the architecture was written in the first place. I don't think we need to update the architecture if somebody's found a new and interesting way to use the existing architecture. If there are new use cases that architecture doesn't solve, then we should work on an updated document.
So in short, if I wanted to push use cases that are new and not in the now expired draft, put them somewhere on the internet, but not in that draft, don't send a PR there for the use cases.
Correct.
All right. Next question.
This is Hank. Sorry.
Hey, Hank. How do you think this works with the queue, Hank? But go ahead.
So, Carsten said in chat that we just keep the expired ID as our use case box. And there is no reason not to update that ID 6 years later to add a use case and then let it expire again. So we can manage that box in Infinitant. And that's a great use case for it.
That's a nice box.
Well, I mean, if you all think that that's worth doing, thank you, Hank. I basically was asking because I wanted to add some last IETF and I didn't do it, but I've been inspired again by something. I was asking if people actually care to deal with those PRs because it's annoying until it's something so useful but different that it warrants thought on the architecture, which I understand what Steve is saying. So
I mean,
if not, I can ask in the mailing list. I asked this in my review of the architecture. I basically pointed this out. I was like, what do? I don't really have a dog in the fight. I don't care that much.
Okay.
But the other question about the information model. So it's really not an information model. It's an interaction model. I mean, I love the architecture. I mean, I do have criticisms and I wrote a lengthy thing about them, but that aside, we don't really talk about, I see an interaction model and I could be wrong about IETF culture and whether it goes beyond just AJ's individual opinion, and like flow diagrams or how the different pieces of the puzzle interact. We don't get very deep in that in the architecture, so I don't see how an interaction model is something that we don't need. I could see like maybe the information model piece is there. So we really are saying we've sufficiently documented in the architecture the bare minimum viable complex interactions that we've talked about and got confused about today. Like sufficiently, we don't need to do the work somewhere.
I think
I see value in it, but others are saying otherwise. I'm kind of surprised.
Yeah, I think the position we're taking at this point is we have done the work that meets the bar. Is there always opportunity to do more? Yeah, but those who ship is a important aspect. We'd like to get this done.
Okay, Hank, if this can be under 15 seconds, do it. Otherwise, queue's locked.
No problem. I think the interaction model is in the Scrappy.
Great.
on the mailing list. I'm going to ask you to point me to it. So get ready.
Okay.
Yeah, take Thibaut. He's been waiting.
Thibaut?
Yes. Hey, Thibaut, Cloudflare. Yes, agree. Good to see good progress. I really like the architecture document, so thanks for moving the work for that. One question I have so I agree with the format, having like one format is definitely much better with cozy and etc. How do you think that reconciles, for instance, with existing deployment, for instance, I don't know, SCITT, which has also, for instance, other API and etc. Are these communities you're discussing with to make sure that I don't know, I don't need to have two actions or etc. Or is it something that's distinct from this effort?
I can answer that if you want, Steve.
Well, so the chairs really want to get to a conversation about last call, and time is up. So
Okay.
if you can do it in less than 10 seconds.
So SigStore is in conversations on OpenSSF with integrations with SCITT. Ori did a nice presentation in a slide deck. You can probably get it off of him. SigStore is about signing, and SCITT is about policy and notarization. So the two of them are not exactly in overlap on top of one another.
Okay. Next.
That's it.
Thank you.
It is here. So we actually would really like to go to last call on the architecture draft. I will note that using GitHub, and the working group has been very good about using GitHub to do it. We can see that there's been a lot of different people who've worked on the draft, so I'm not going to kind of do any poll. Is there any reason for the chairs not to move the architecture draft to last call? I know there's a few outstanding items, but I believe those can probably be dealt with, from what I understand, is left in last call. So I'm looking for anybody who's got a countering opinion. Otherwise, I'm going to move it to last call, but I'll give it at least 3-4 weeks so that those last set of items can be handled. I'm hearing nothing. Expect the architecture draft to go into last call. Any closing comments? Or over time?
Yeah, we're over time. So thanks very much for staying over, people who are in odd time zones. And thanks very much to the editors and authors for getting us to this point. Do we? No, we were till 11. Oh, did we get 2? I only I only requested 90 minutes.
Actually, you missed the deadline.
Oh, you did. Right. Okay. Oh, great. Well, yeah. So to the agenda.
Back to the agenda.
30 minutes of open mic.
That's right. Open mic, but we're still moving it to last call. And I'll unlock the queue.
Do you think you need a virtual intro to finish the last call in 6 weeks? Mike, you want to go? Excellent.
That's good.
Would you like to schedule a virtual interim in about 6 weeks to nail the coffin on the last call of documents?
It sounds sensible, yes. I think especially if we get, so we've had a couple of very excellent and long and thorough reviews, yours being one of them. We would, yeah, and Hannes as well. So yeah, if we get significant, substantial feedback, then clearly an interim would be a useful way to solve those. We'll try to do it on the list first. But yeah, let's plan to have one when we get the last call in. We should plan an interim for a week before that expires, I think.
Yeah, I mean, well, I'll take a look at the calendar too to make sure I'm avoiding typical holidays, et cetera, and not putting it, say, right before, right after one. So I'm not going to commit exactly to 6.5, 7 weeks precisely at the moment.
Aram Welling again, sorry. So I didn't understand fully about the additional use cases. What was the conclusion on that? It will be posted how? I know there was some acronym used, being new here. PR. I don't know what that means. But someone could just explain.
PR is just pull request on GitHub for. So there is a use case document in the working group GitHub. But kind of currently the IETF doesn't advance the use case documents into RFC publication. And so they're more useful in, as the working group works through developing their other documents, which will get published as standards or informational. Since the use case doc, as it is in the working group GitHub, isn't going to be published, the question was, should we stop handling the PRs and lock down the existing use case document there, and future use cases can be documented somewhere else?
Okay, so we'll just find out sometime in the future where those would be posted.
Yeah, but they won't
Okay.
become an RFC at any point.
Oh, yeah, I understand. Thank you.
So this is Henk. Am I? Yeah. So there sometimes, and I'm not entirely sure how the tool works. So in data tracker, of course, can highlight when a adopted ID is expired, but chairs can also associate specific documents with the data tracker manually. So they will always show up. So if we do that with use case documents, in plural here, these will always be visible as related documents, expired or not. So that could be one way to do that very visible.
So yes, with the caveat of then they show up. So some ADs don't appreciate that, in that they then stay on the list of documents that an AD should be thinking about with a working group. So I can tell you, at least a WIT AD of mine was like, hey, clean that out. So
Well, we can chart a milestone to never remove those documents.
yeah. So I mean, yeah, Hank. I mean, Hank, we'll figure out a way. I mean, every working group also has a wiki, so we could also kind of have pointers to that information off of the working group wiki too. So yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of options here. As long as we have make a well-known pointer, I think is the victory is achieved, right?
Okay, yeah. So unless there's anyone else, our excellent misunderstanding gets us half an hour of our lives back, I think. So again, thanks very much to the authors and editors. It's been a lot of work, but I think we're in great shape now. So thanks very much.
So you might not need a virtual intro, but I'm suggesting to schedule it and cancel it if you have to, rather than make me scramble. Right. But I'm saying like go for like April 30th or May 5th or something.